Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about the famous Berlin Blockade. Let's get started. So a brief overview. This started in June 1948. And it was because, tensions between the USSR and the Western Allies, essentially marking the beginning of the Cold War. And it was the first major conflict, so yeah, it was like the first. It also involved like Britain, but it was the first event in which there was USSR versus Western powers. Well, essentially, the Soviet Union wanted to limit the United States, Britain, and France from accessing their sectors of Berlin, which were in Russian territory. And the U.S. had this new economic policy to aid Germany and other European nations, and the USSR clearly did not like this. They weren't huge fans. So the Western Allies also tried to incorporate this new currency into Berlin and Germany, which the USSR, like I said, they weren't a huge fan of. And so the Soviets, in response to all this, decided that the greatest idea would be to block all rail, road, and canal access to the Western zone, and overall restrict 2.5 million civilians from having access to food, medicine, fuel, electricity, and any other basic goods. And in response, the Western Allies produces Airlift, which I'm not going to talk about in huge detail, but yeah. So let's start. We first have to look at the post-war division of Germany and Berlin, for that matter. Well, after the Second World War, the victors, so US, Britain, France, and the USSR, decided that they would divide Berlin into four occupied zones, and they decided this at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Then they solidified this decision in the Potsdam Conference later that year, if I'm not mistaken, in May 1945, maybe June. Later on that year, once Germany had already surrendered. And Germany would be split into four zones. So in the east would be the USSR, and then in the west would be America, Britain, France, in that order, if I'm not mistaken, although I may be. And then Berlin, in turn, would also be divided into four zones, in the East Berlin being the USSR, and then America, Britain, and France. And Berlin was in the eastern part of Germany, so Berlin itself was in the Russian occupied territory of Germany. So Stalin, he had this really tough guy attitude towards Germany because he wanted to punish them economically, like Clemenceau had done back in the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted to force them to make war reparations and contribute, this is the tough part that didn't sit well with the Allies, contribute its industrial technology to help post-war Soviet recovery, and only Soviet recovery. Well, the Allies, however, they had learned from their mistakes of the First World War. They knew that if they imposed terms that were too harsh, they could create a potential enemy, as well as maybe even making Germany a possible victim to communism, which was beginning to spread. So they thought it was essential and crucial to have Germany recover properly, to establish a democratic style government to try and stop the spread of communism that had been rising. The USSR, of course, was a huge fan of communism and wanted it to keep spreading. So the next part. This is still not the actual blockade, by the way. This is the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Well, in March 1947, just 2 years after, a few months short of 2 years after the war had ended, there had been rebellions in Greece and Turkey, communist rebellions. Now, Truman, who was president after FDR died, he didn't like this. He wanted to stop this communist spread, this domino effect. And he thought, okay, fine, I'm gonna give economic and military aid to countries struggling. He sold this as, I'm going to just give them aid, help them recover from the war, that's it. But reality, he was just like, if I help them, they're less likely to turn to the extremes. Communism. So, well, this proved to be a new era of global engagement for the US and further articulated the divide between Western democracies and Western democracies and Eastern Soviet Union ideologies, because that was more of an authoritarian regime. So, in June of 1947, the Secretary of State, Marshall, that's his surname, by the way, not his name. He announced this new plan for an European recovery program named as the Marshall Plan. Now, the Truman Doctrine was the idea behind it. I mean, kind of like the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, but like it's not the actual plan. The implementation is just the idea. The Marshall Plan was the way in which the Truman Doctrine was implemented in Europe. And well, it was, like I said, it was to help European nations rebuild after the war, and only rebuild. And it was thought of in June 1947, but was implemented in April 1948. Well, Stalin had this vision of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe post-war, and he also hoped that the U.S. would, obviously stay in Europe for a while to make sure everything was okay, but then completely leave. He didn't like the idea that the U.S. was sending military aid to Europe because he wanted full control, and he couldn't do that with the U.S. interfering. So the USSR couldn't really establish this Soviet sphere of influence. So now comes the Soviet decision to blockade Berlin. Well, the American, British, and French representatives met in London to discuss Germany's future. I love how Germany is not even involved. Politicians in Germany, yes, they were under the control of these countries, but you'd think they have Germany as a major, as someone in the room at least. And also the USSR was not invited. Well, the American and British would combine their zones to create Bizonia, and then the French would join later on to create Trisonia. And overall, they wanted to make this single West German state. Again, note how the USSR was not included. Well, and they also wanted to incorporate the American, British, and French zones of Berlin into their own zone, to use a single stable currency. Well, the Soviets, they heard about this and they didn't love it. And by March 1948, they're like, yeah, we've had enough. And they withdrew from the Allied Control Council. This was March 1948, a month before the Marshall Plan was implemented. By this point, Stalin fully knew about this Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. Well, June 1948, so remember, the blockade was in June 1948, but this is before the blockade. US and British officials decided they would introduce the Deutsche Mark, Deutsche Mark being this new currency, into Bizonia and West Berlin without informing the USSR. So now the USSR just saw how these Western powers were implementing this new currency without the support of the USSR. And so the Soviets said, fine, you do that, I'll do the same. They implemented the Ostmark, or how you pronounce that, Ostmark. Anyway, they introduced a new currency into Berlin and East Germany on June 24th, 1948. Oh, good now. That's the whole issue with Berlin and nothing else. Nothing else happened. Something else happened. That same day, June 24th, 1948, they blocked all accesses to the Allied occupied zones of Berlin. So, it's not that they blockaded Eastern Berlin. No, they blockaded Western Berlin. Because then people living in Western Berlin couldn't access the western part of Germany because for miles and miles, they were still in Soviet-occupied Germany. So that was kind of a not a good move for Stalin. No, I mean, it was a good move strategically, but he wasn't a nice guy. He wasn't being nice. And he also said, okay, this new four-way that we're administering, the capital of the country, yeah, this is mine now, so that four-way administration has ended. Well, so the lasting impact, no, the last section is the lasting impact of the blockade and Allied response. So Stalin's little blockade, it cut 2.5 million civilians from having, like, in the three western sectors of Berlin, from having electricity, food, coal supplies. And also the Red Army, which was kind of stationed outside Berlin, vastly outnumbered the Allied military forces around and in Berlin. Now, this was a tough situation in international relations because literally 3 years before they had just gotten out of this huge conflict named the Second World War. And now Stalin was like, yeah, we're gonna let people die and I'm stationing my troops around. Well, they couldn't exactly risk war because no power, I mean, despite what they said, no world power was able to fight. Maybe the US, but the USSR was still quite powerful. And they didn't exactly want to risk a war, another war. So the US and Britain, by this point, June 48, they could maintain this control of a 320-mile wide airstrip, like 320-mile wide airways in West Berlin in West Germany into West Berlin. So on June 26th, they decided to organize this whole Berlin Airlift, in which they transported goods and resources to help the people in West Germany, not East Germany, because that was still under the control of the Soviets. They only helped West Germany because, that's still under their control. The fact that they've been blockaded by the Soviets didn't stop them from being under the British, French, and American control. Well, the blockade, like Stalin had hoped, Stalin wanted the blockade to demoralize the British and the American and the French, and essentially it caused them to abandon this new idea of a unified Germany, and these efforts to create a Western German state. But the Allies, no, the Allies were resilient. They kept on going, essentially. And, well, Stalin, he saw that this wasn't helping. And, well, I mean, I'm just going to mention this quick fact. When the planes were going into West Berlin, the Berlin Airlift, Stalin couldn't exactly shoot them down. Because if he shot them down, there would be an act of war. And if he did that, there would be a new war, and he couldn't risk that. So Stalin's like, okay, fine. This did not work. Fine, you win. And lifted the blockade in May 1949. So it almost lasted a year, 11 months. Just kind of impressive. A lot of people died because of Stalin. And Stalin wasn't exactly an angel. And, I mean, what it really did was enhance this division between the East and the West of Europe, and just, increase tensions and just cause ideologies to crash. So that's pretty much it. The Berlin Blockade, it was a huge event in Germany, obviously, and a lot of people died. Conditions were horrible. There's nowhere near the Berlin Wall, by the way. That is in 20 years after that. But this Berlin Blockade marked the first major combat, although it wasn't a combat, of the Cold War. That's pretty much it. I have nothing else to say, so yeah. I'm going to leave it there. I hope you liked it, and I hope you found it useful, and yeah. Thank you for watching. Bye.